Today we are in Malta, one of the many islands across the Roman Empire. Isn't it amazing how much Roman influence you can find all the way from Britain to Africa to the Middle East, and they're all tied together by Rome. Despite the incredible diversity, let's discuss how the Roman conquest began, how they managed to maintain such a vast empire, because that is even more impressive, by tolerance, laws, development, and also let's discuss how ultimately all of that stopped working. To start talking about the Roman Empire, we gotta go back to where it all began, and that is Rome. Rome initially was one of the various city-states in the Italian peninsula that first expanded through sheer aggression and diplomacy on the local level, but later that power snowballed to multiple continents. What is very important to note is that Rome started in a prime location for conquest. It was positioned in the central Mediterranean, which was the location for a budding empire, and it was well positioned for trade by both land and sea. Early success came from aggressive expansion as well as diplomacy, where they could conquer the nearby Etruscan, Latin, and Greek settlements, all this obviously fueled by their culture, but Rome wasn't always the incredibly dominant empire. In fact, in their early days, there were quite a few times where they were near the brink of destruction. The first sack of Rome happened by the Gauls from the north, and the second big turning point in Roman history were the Punic Wars against Carthage. Carthage at the time was actually quite a bit more powerful than Rome, and this initially started as a war of competition, but then it just spiraled into a war of utter destruction. Initially, Rome was mainly a land power, but these Punic Wars forced Rome to build a strong navy, which ultimately helped them conquer the entire Mediterranean, and later it became known as Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. The second big event was the eventual conquest of all of Greece and later Gaul, and ultimately at this point Rome kinda grew too big to fall, so later expansions were mainly fueled by political needs or what was currently going on at the time. So in a simplified way, it was kind of smooth sailing in further expanding their empire from this point. Furthermore, another really important point to get across is the military sense of the conquest, because Rome was incredibly advanced. It was not just the discipline, but also the military formations, the machines they were using, so they were really far too advanced for a lot of the surrounding civilizations, which made their conquests quite easy, especially as a lot of times they actually had fewer numbers. Now keep in mind, all of this is super oversimplified. I mean, you could literally take years just to study this subject alone, but this is, at the end of the day, just a simple YouTube video. But now that we've discussed how Rome grew, let's discuss how did they actually manage to establish and maintain such a vast empire, because Rome isn't just known for its size, but it's also known for its culture that is still present up to this day. So let's go back to Malta and let's discuss how that happened. Malta, while a small island, was actually a crucial naval and trade hub of the Roman Empire that they used to maintain dominance over the central Mediterranean, and originally, as most of the places, it had a native population of its own that was eventually just turned into Roman citizens. It was taken from the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War. Eventually it became a part of the province of Sicily, and here a process happened that was replicated 1,000 times over. The place started adopting Roman laws, Roman customs, they built roads that still exist up to this day, and eventually Malta just became Rome. Now, Rome had a very specific way of conquest that was not really shared by many of the contemporary empires of the time. It was essentially one big melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions, and this was one of the key factors to keeping the empire united. They also significantly enriched the areas they had conquered by bringing trade routes, laws. They also introduced a really advanced administrative systems, which in a big way increased the quality of life for the people that were conquered. Now, don't get me wrong, no one is saying that Rome was the benevolent hand freeing the destitute people of the world and showing them the light. The conquests were definitely not pretty. In a lot of ways, they were often justified as civilization against the barbarians, but you gotta admit, it was really impressive how efficient the Roman Empire maintenance was, especially when you consider how ridiculously diverse it was and how many, just the sheer number of languages that were spoken within the actual empire. Rome did impose its customs in a way, but not heavily. The most important part was the Roman law. Eventually, Roman citizenship was extended to most of the citizens of the entire empire, but most of the times the regulations were very loose, so they would respect local traditions, religions, and laws as long as they didn't conflict too heavily with the central Roman authority. Religious tolerance was a huge factor, and as the state religion was polytheistic, they had a lot of flexibility to even add new gods to their own pantheon from the conquered territories. So that is, for example, why pretty much the Greek mythology is very similar to the Roman mythology. They also added the Egyptian goddess Isis, they added the Persian god Mithras, even though Mithras wasn't really a Persian god, he was just inspired by him, but his cult was found all throughout the empire, and I got a whole video on that you can check out. But the overall point is they were just mixing and mashing all these gods together into one big melting pot, but of course it wasn't without conditions. Rome did expect all the people to recognize their deities, to participate in the state rituals, but you could also keep worshipping your own local gods. However, this didn't really work out with some religious groups in the Middle East, and this led to significant conflict. However, for most of the empire, this worked out perfectly, especially as most other people practiced polytheistic religions, so they were also flexible as well. Other than religion, as I previously mentioned, Roman law was one of the key factors, and this was especially used in terms of contracts, citizenship, and property, and it was uniform across the entire empire, and this ensured loyalty for most of the provinces. Now, all this sounds great. You would think Roman Empire was this amazingly stable thing. However, it eventually broke out in a huge disaster. So what exactly happened? Let's go back to the studio and let's discuss that. Once again, discussing why Rome fell apart in a simple YouTube video is definitely oversimplifying things, because we have multiple books written just on this subject alone, but to simplify it as much as possible, it was essentially a death of 1,000 cuts that happened over the span of a few hundred years. One of the biggest problems and the biggest enemy of Rome was Rome itself, because they had just constantly spiraled into these gigantic civil wars and the various power struggles. I mean, literally at one point in time they had 4 emperors ruling the empire, so really it all started falling apart from within. However, as with most problems and most empires falling, economy was a really big deal. First of all, Rome heavily relied on slave trade, and inequality grew bigger and bigger, so this was a problem as well. But another big problem was that the fact that they just overstretched themselves. Roman legions could no longer cover the entire borders of the empire, and it just started going crazy, so this became really ripe for the taking from the surrounding barbarian tribes. Also, eventually they just started relying more and more on mercenaries that weren't exactly too loyal to Rome. They were just loyal to whoever paid them the most. Their tolerance turned against them, and what once made things really work well and brought harmony to the empire ultimately turned into their worst nightmare. A culturally Roman unified identity began to decline, so a lot of the parts of the empire became more loyal to their own than they were to the central Roman authority. Religions were also a huge problem. I mean, Christianity in particular caused a significant civil war, which significantly weakened Rome. Furthermore, natural disasters occurred at the same time, so it made a bad situation even worse, and we had a few plagues that were incredibly devastating. Overall, the fall of Rome is incredibly multi-layered, and it was a process that lasted for hundreds of years. It was quite gradual. A lot of people forget that Rome ultimately fell in the 15th century, not the 5th, because that is when the Western Empire fell. But this Western-Eastern split was also a significant problem, because once they split into 2 parts, Western Roman Empire was significantly weaker, which amplified all these problems by quite a bit. Most historians agree that Rome had really peaked in the 2nd century AD, and it definitely peaked size-wise, but from that point forward it just started shrinking further and further, and ultimately it just disappeared from the map. Thank you for watching. Check out my video on Slavic mythology and the god Perun, and also subscribe for more videos like this.